Oops. Check, check. All right. We on? Okay, so I don't think any of you were here last week, so I will repeat. So when I started printing out these handouts, I did it wrong. In my defense, it's because things are numbered counterintuitively. So the questions are actually for the lesson after the one that it's numbered. So the questions for lesson 3 are actually for lesson 4. The questions that are labeled lesson 2 are actually the ones for lesson 3. So stuff is a little bit backwards, and I'm fixing it as I'm printing out new ones, but I didn't want to just print out a bunch of new ones and waste paper just because I had stuff out of order. So we're still a little disorganized, and I apologize for that, but we are quickly getting caught up to where the papers will actually be how they should be. I think next week they'll be how they should be. So today we are on lesson 3. Should say lesson 3 up in the corner. There should be handouts on the back chair if you don't have one. But the questions are the ones that say lesson 2 at the top. And I actually put those on the back of the lesson 1 packets because I thought the lesson 2 questions went with lesson 2, and so I gave those to you at the end of week 1 so you could fill them out to go through them on lesson 2. So now that I understand that, I can try to print things out in the right way, but yeah, I just assumed the questions for lesson 2 would go with lesson 2, and they don't. So the lesson 2 questions are on the back of the lesson 1 packet, but they apply to lesson 3, which is what we're talking about today. Right here. Yeah, so I think the lesson 3 handout is only one page because there aren't any questions on it. So then the questions that will go for lesson 4 are titled lesson 3, and they're on the back of the lesson 2 packets. I'm sorry. Yeah, so if you have the lesson 2 packet, the questions are on there, and if not, I printed out just the question sheet so I can give you that at the end. But yeah, hopefully by next week I'll be printing stuff off in the right order. I don't understand why you would label something lesson 2 if the questions are for lesson 3, and that's where everything went awry. So I apologize for that. Okay, so we are still in the first chapter of Ruth. So you can see on your lesson 3 handouts, it tells us that this is Ruth 1, 6 through 22. So we'll be looking at the rest of chapter 1 today. Go through the questions, talk a bit, and hopefully we still get out of here roughly on time without too much padding either way. Clear as mud? All right. So, I think the way it worked last week is we kind of read through the text and then we did the questions, and then I did kind of the lecture note things that we have here, and I think that worked out pretty well. A lot of the lecture note stuff comes out in the questions anyway, so I figure that's just kind of a nice little wrap up to cover anything we missed, so I'll probably keep that same format. So I'll read the text, we'll go through the questions, and then I'll add the author's notes from there. So Ruth 1, 6 through 22. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. When you die, I will die, where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, Is this Naomi? She said to them, Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. All right, so we're on the personal application questions for Lesson 2, which is on the back of the Lesson 1 packet. Again, sorry, everything's a mess. All right, question 1. What news reached Naomi, and how did she react to the news? Very start, verse 6. Right. So Ruth is out in the. So remember, Elimelech and his family. Elimelech's dead now, but he brought the family over to Moab because of a famine in Israel. They're sojourning there. Elimelech and his sons both die. So now Naomi is out in the fields working, and she hears the gossip mill says that the famine in Israel is over. The Lord has brought food back to the people. Presumably, assuming the famine was caused by Israel's sins, which it may or may not have been, then that would mean Israel has repented. They've turned back to God. God is giving them food again. And so Naomi hears there's food back in Israel, so she is going to make plans to return to Israel because the only reason they left was for lack of food. So now that food is back there, she's going to go back home. But what does she say to her daughters? Or daughters-in-law, I should say. Right. So she's planning to go to Israel by herself. She tells Ruth and Orpah to stay in Moab. And we'll discuss that some more in the future questions, so I'm not going to go into that now. Question 2, then. Who is credited for bringing an end to the famine? Right. So verse 6 at the end says that she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So God is being given the credit for bringing about the harvest, or bringing the harvest back. As we discussed last week, there is scriptural precedent for saying that God had caused the famine in the first place because of Israel's hard-headedness, or hard-heartedness, I guess, because you do have verses in Deuteronomy where God kind of sets up this twofold promise for Israel. If you remain my people, stuff's going to go really well for you. If you turn against me, stuff's going to go really bad. And part of the really bad stuff that he promises is drought and famine. And we know this is in the time of the Judges, where Israel's on this very cyclical, worships God, turns away from God, comes back to God, turns away from God loop. And so it's entirely possible, given the context of Judges, that Israel had turned away from God, and that's what brought about the famine in the land. And if that's the case, then this means Israel has now come back to God. God has returned food. So now Naomi can make plans to return. All right, question 3 is our personal reflection, awkward personal story time. God bountifully provides daily food for us. Share with the group how you thank Him for His daily provisions. Yeah, how do you thank Him for daily provisions? Right. So giving our praise to God. Remember, this is the Lutheran view of worship versus the more evangelical view that's a little bit pagan. Um, we give praise to God as a thanks for what He's already done. We're not doing it to try to butter Him up and earn favor from Him. That's a very pagan idea. That's kind of how evangelical people tend to look at worship if you really dig through everything. But when we're praising God, that is giving Him thanks for what He's already done. Worship always starts with God giving His gifts to us. Again, the service starts with God pouring out His forgiveness to us in the confession absolution, and then we respond in praise and thanksgiving. When you're oh. Right. So every prayer should be opening with thanking God. Um, and when Jesus gives us the Lord's Prayer, it's because the disciples come up to Him and they say, "Hey God, hey Jesus, how should we pray?" And so He gives them the Lord's Prayer, which is a prayer in itself, but it's also a model on how we ought to pray, and the petitions within it remind us of the sorts of things we should be praying for. And it opens up, "Our Father who art in heaven," so that tells us exactly who we're praying to. No, He tells us to pray to the Father, not to the saints. But then the very next thing is, "Hallowed be thy name." That's a worshiping of God and who He is. It's a recognition of all that He's done for you. Um, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." That's still a praising of God and a recognition of who He is and recognizing that He's in control of everything. It's not until after you do that praise and recognition of Him that you get to be actually asking God for things for yourself. "Give us this day our daily bread." Um, in the same way, we should be opening prayers in a praise of God, and in praising Him, we're also thanking Him for being praiseworthy and all that He's done for us. So when I was a wee little lad in confirmation class, they taught us what's called the ACTS model of prayer, ACTS. Have you heard that before? Where you start out with adoration, and then a confession, and then a thanksgiving, and then supplication that's when you're asking for stuff for yourself. And it's that same idea. You start off recognizing who God is and thanking Him for all that He's given you before you try to treat Him like a genie and ask Him to help you win the lottery. Uh, but then our practice of praying before meals, which hopefully we're all in the habit of doing, that's the goal of that, is that recognition that God ultimately gave that food to you. I mean, yes, He works through means. He works through the farmer and the trucker and the grocer and all the steps along the way that get that food to your table. But ultimately, excuse me, He's the one who made the crops grow, who made the cow eat the grass, whatever you're eating. Um, He's the one who put you in the position where you're able to afford that food and prepare it and all of that. And so you start off thanking God that He has provided this meal. That is your daily bread, your daily provisions. And you open it, before you even start eating it, you thank God for it. You recognize that it's a gift from God, and hopefully that helps to, again, shape your mindset around how you treat all of your possessions. It's not, nothing is yours, everything is God's. He has just made you a steward over certain things. And so by regularly thanking Him for all that you have, it helps remind you of that mindset to help stave off the greed inherent to our nature, where we want to say, "This is mine." Instead, you recognize this is God's. He has given it to me, so I will always thank Him for it in order to remind me of that right mindset about my possessions. That all makes sense. I'm still talking coherently? Okay. I did not sleep very well 2 nights ago, and I'm still catching up. Lydia woke up at, yeah, Saturday morning, I guess technically. Lydia woke up at 2, and she would not fall asleep for Magdalena, so I had to hold her, and I couldn't sleep while holding a baby, and I wasn't able to hand her back off to Magdalena until like 4:30. And I had not gone to bed yet either. I was planning to go to bed at 2. So yeah, yesterday I was running off of like 4 hours of sleep, and I'm still catching up. So sorry if I'm less coherent than usual today. Not that I'm usually that coherent, but there we go. All right, question 4. We kind of answered this already in question 1. I'm not sure why they made it a separate one, but when Naomi heard that the famine had ended in Judah, what plans did she make? Again, she's planning to go back to her homeland, but she's planning to do it alone. She tells Orpah and Naomi to remain in Moab. She'll go back to Israel on her own and deal with her fate there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah. I don't know what I don't know what the laws are like in Moab, but I know in Israel they do have mandates to care for the widow and the orphan. Gleaning is a law, which we'll talk about in the coming chapters when the gleaning actually happens. Plus, the simple fact Naomi probably has family back in Israel. They may not be close family, they may be extended relatives, but there's also a societal implication that you take care of your family to a certain extent. Like, she's not guaranteed her own house or anything, but she's more likely to get family assistance back where her family is, the country of Moab. Plus, it's her home. So it makes sense for Naomi to go back. She tells Ruth and Orpah to remain behind, and we'll talk about the reason why in the next question. So anything else we want to add on 5 before we move on? Good. Didn't think so. Again, it's mostly a repeat of 1, but 6. So the 3 women. Wait. Sorry, we're on 5 now. Yeah, sorry. Like I said, I'm sleep deprived. So who went with Naomi, and why do you think they accompanied Naomi? Yeah. Actually, at this part, both of them are going with her. So if you look at the top above question 1, it says Ruth 1, 6 through 10. So technically these questions only apply up to verse 10. And in verse 10, they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." Verse 11 is where Naomi entreats them to turn back, and Orpah goes back. So at this point, initially, both daughters-in-law start to go to Naomi, or start to go with Naomi. As to why, I think the implication is they had a really close bond. Like, the handouts are kind of big on drawing out that this is not the stereotypical mother-in-law daughter-in-law relationship, but they actually like each other. They knew each other. Naomi had been in the land of Moab for 10 years. She lived with Orpah and Ruth for 10 years, because verse 4 tells us her sons took Moabite wives, and they lived there about 10 years. So they knew each other for 10 years before the sons die. We don't know exactly how long after the sons have died that they journey back. It might have been another 10 years for all we know. Probably not that long. But they lived together. They knew each other really well. When Mahlon and Chilion die, and Ruth and Orpah become widows, Naomi was already a widow, and we talked last week how they kind of had the grief support group going on there. They bonded through pain, I guess. Probably not the best way to phrase that, but there you go. So they were close, and they didn't want to just say, okay, have fun moving back home. I'll never see you again. Bye. They wanted to stick with Naomi. They didn't want to sever that bond. They were more mother-daughter relationship than mother-in-law, daughter-in-law at this point, and so they start to accompany her back to her homeland. Then, but then question 6, 3 women began the journey to Naomi's homeland. What reason did Naomi give for sending her daughters-in-law back to Moab? And again, this is only up to verse 10, so there's a first reason and then a second reason in verse 12 when she tells them again to go back. So the first time she tells them to return, verse 8, what's her reasoning for trying to send them back? That's the second reason that comes in the next section. Yeah. Right. So return to your mother's home, which is, again, basically saying, no, your whole family is here. Come with me to Israel. You're going to be foreigners because you're Moabites. You're not going to have any family other than me, and I'm a widow pretty low on the totem pole. I'm not going to be able to look after you very well. You're probably not going to like it. You should go back. Your family is here. Your life is here. Your people are here. You should go back and find comfort with them. It's going to be a lot easier than if you have to come and try to make a new life in Israel with me. And how did they react? This is the first warning, and they don't really listen to them at that point, because then verse 10 they're still saying, no, we'll go with you. So they don't quite buy her excuses. They're kind of sad, they're torn about it either way. They're still intending to go back with Naomi. And then it's verse 11 where she starts to tell them again to go back, and that's when they split up. So that question comes in the next part of the questions. But for now, they're still intending to remain with Naomi. They're planning to go back with her. All right, changing topics a little bit. Question 8. Many false gods were worshipped in Moab. Which false god was most attributed to them? 2 Kings 23:13. And state what you know about the false god. 2 Kings 23:13 tells us, and the king defiled the high places that were east of Jerusalem, to the south of the Mount of Corruption, which Solomon the king of Israel had built for Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Chemosh was the chief god of Moab, according to 2 Kings and other references in the Bible. Random pop quiz. Does anyone here know anything about Chemosh? Not expecting you to. Yeah. So I did a little bit of digging on this, and from the resources I have, we don't really know a whole lot about Chemosh, largely because the entire Moabite culture gets destroyed by, I think, the Babylonians. So really the only records we have of Chemosh are in the Old Testament, and there's like one stone inscription that has like a chapter of the Moabite scriptures on it that talks a little bit about Chemosh, but not a whole lot. So a lot of it's conjecture. We don't know a whole lot about him. We know he was the chief god of Moab. And remember, in this time and place, people they're polytheistic in that they believe in different gods, but they don't necessarily have a pantheon like the Romans and the Greeks do. There's a specific term for it that I just completely forgot. But there's this idea that there's multiple gods, but each god is kind of supreme over his chunk of land. Um, and so, like, the Moabites would acknowledge that Yahweh is a god, but they would say he's the God of Israel. So if you're in Israel's country, you would pray to Yahweh and you do whatever rituals he wanted, but he doesn't have jurisdiction over here in Moab, and Chemosh doesn't have any jurisdiction over in the land of the Ammonites. Each god kind of has his own country, and whatever country you're in, you worship that god. So they acknowledge the presence of other gods, and they don't, but they don't necessarily worship the other gods. They just kind of pick the one for their country and worship him. And so from the Moabite view, Chemosh is here and Yahweh is over here, and maybe sometimes they fight, which is what happens when the countries go to war with each other. But they would probably see them as kind of on equal footing. From what we have of the inscription about Chemosh, it seems like some scholars think that a lot of the rituals of the Moabites looked a lot like that of the Israelites, so Chemosh is maybe kind of a copycat sort of deal, except we do know that people did human sacrifice to Chemosh, which, some Israelites did do human sacrifice to Yahweh as well, but you're not supposed to. The Old Testament is pretty adamant that human sacrifice is an abomination in God's eyes. Israelites do it anyway. That's ultimately why the northern kingdom falls to Assyria, because God gets tired of them doing human sacrifice to other gods. But yeah, most of the other nations around Israel, you would do human sacrifice in one form or another, often infants and babies. I don't know about Chemosh in particular, but the Baal worshippers, they would have a iron statue of Baal that they would light a fire inside of it, so the iron would get really, really, really hot, and they would put a baby on the arms of the statue and let it burn to death, and the cries of the baby would ascend to Baal, and he would hear the baby's cries, and that's how you get his attention and ask him to do special favors for you. Similar with Molech and all the other gross gods that the people worshipped. So Chemosh is not the cheeriest. I mean, again, a lot of the stuff about him they kind of probably copied from what they picked up from Israel and the other cultures around. But yeah, they would do human sacrifice to Chemosh. He's a false god anyway, but that just makes it even more egregious. So, not really the best place to be if you're looking at how your neighbors might influence your religious practices. So I'll come back to that question a little bit later. But now changing topic, or unless, do we have anything else we want to talk about there? Yeah, okay. Changing topics a little bit more then. Question 9, what law existed in Israel? And they point us to the one they're asking about in Deuteronomy 25, because there's a lot of laws in Israel. But what law is referenced in Deuteronomy 25, and would this apply to Naomi? If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside of the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. Yeah. Right. So, Levirate marriage is kind of weird in the first place, especially in our modern contexts. But yeah, it would not directly, as far as we can tell, it does not directly apply to Naomi. Like, if Elimelech had a brother, maybe, but we don't know about that. And again, they're in a different country, so the brothers are not dwelling together anyway. And we're going to kind of, the Levirate marriage will apply to well, in some ways apply to how Ruth's story plays out. But even then, it's not really a Levirate marriage because Ruth is not considered an Israelite right now because she was not, even though she married an Israelite because she was not born in Israel, she's not considered an Israelite. She's still a Moabite. Um, Spoiler alert, but when she marries Boaz, then she'll be recognized as an Israelite. But when she's married, it's a Levirate marriage, doesn't apply to her either way. But that's what Naomi is referencing when she does send them away. It's like, I don't have other sons that you can get married to as part of my people's cultural practices to make sure you have husbands. Even if I had a husband and I got pregnant, are you going to wait for another 15 years for him to come of age and you can marry him off? Like, no, go find a guy your age now. I can't provide for you. And yeah, if Elimelech had a brother, then he would be, when Naomi goes back to Israel, he would be required to marry her and try to give Elimelech an heir. But since she doesn't get married as soon as she returns to Israel, it doesn't seem like he has a brother. There are relatives that come into play. But yeah, she does not have a guaranteed husband back in Israel waiting for her like she might have under the laws of Levirate marriage. Levirate, I don't know how to pronounce it. It's all making some sort of sense. But yeah. All right. Question 10, more abstract thought. Describe in your own words the bond that existed between Naomi and her two daughters-in-law, and is this typical of mother-daughter-in-law relationships? Right. Yeah. 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 So they've had this bonding through pain, the mutual grief of all being widows, the hard times of having to provide for themselves as widows. All of these things brought them together, and so in a lot of ways, they seem more like mother-daughter than how we think of mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationships. Um, of course, the stereotypes nowadays are that the mother-in-law doesn't like the daughter-in-law because she stole the son away from her. Maybe that applied in the time frame. I don't know. Uh, I don't. I don't have access to Bronze Age sitcoms to know how they looked at those sorts of relationships. But assuming the culture was somewhat different, or was similar to today's in that respect, this maybe was an atypical relationship between them. They are much closer than you would assume a mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship would be later on. I think it's in the next chapter. Like Naomi straight up calls Ruth. A little technical difficulty, Simon. Hold up. All right, we're back. Sorry about that. So yeah, there's going to be a part in the text where Naomi straight up refers to Ruth as her daughter, not just her daughter-in-law. So yeah, they're very close. Again, Ruth is willing to leave her homeland and her family just to remain with Naomi through the whole ordeal. So they're pretty close there too as well. All right. Question 11, and remember we're still in verses 6 through 10. In this chunk of text, Naomi blessed each of her daughters-in-law, state the double blessing given to Orpah and Ruth. And this is up in verse 8 and 9. Verses 8 and 9. Right. So the first blessing is, may the Lord deal kindly with you as you have with me and towards the dead. So again, this is a recognition of the mutual love and support in their relationship, just as you have been good daughters-in-laws, you've been caring to me through all of this as you've helped support me. May God do that back to you, kind of the golden rule getting applied back to them. They have treated others well, may God treat them well, sort of thing. And may you find rest in the house of your husband, which they don't have husbands right now, they're widows. But that's implied in that is the wish that they'll find another husband and that they will find rest there, that they'll have a good second marriage with whomever they find. Make sense? Good questions? Pretty straightforward. Okay, question 12 then. How does Naomi demonstrate affection to Orpah and Ruth? Okay. I'm not going to dwell too much on this because honestly, I think it's a bit of an unnecessary question. But she's wishing them well. That's a good way to show affection. This idea that she's trying to send them back for their own sake, I think, is demonstrating a lot of affection. Because again, they're very close, and these ladies have been Naomi's support network for this whole time. She's about to journey back to Israel, where yes, she has family and she's more familiar with the culture, but it's still going to be a big shock. And she's probably a lot more comfortable with Ruth and Orpah than she is with the friends that she hasn't seen for like 12 years back in Israel. But she's trying to send them away rather than having this comfort with her into Israel. She's trying to send them away for their own sake. So I think that's demonstrating some affection and love for them. You know, if you love something, let it go. Or I'm thinking of all those movies in the 80s where like the boy finds a mountain lion cub and then he raises it, but he realizes it has to be free, and so he has to but it doesn't. It wants to stay with the boy, so he has to throw rocks at it to make it mad, so it'll leave and be with its own kind again. That's the sort of affection that we're seeing between them. I think. But, and again, we're only up to verse 10 at this point. What commitment did each daughter-in-law say at this point? Yeah. Yeah. The whole the questions as a whole are 6 through 22, but we're still on 6 through 10. Because if you look above question 14, it says Ruth 1:11 through 18. So question 13 is still applying to verses 6 through 10. And what commitment did each daughter-in-law make at this point? Right, so by verse 10, they're both committing to return back with Naomi. So then in verse 11 is when Naomi tells them a second time to go back. And so, question 14, now what additional reason does Naomi give Orpah and Ruth for staying in the homeland of Moab? And this is the one that first came to mind when we asked back in question 1 or 2, whatever that was. So she's tried to send them away. They insist, no, we're coming with you. So now, verse 11, she tries to send them away again, and this time she adds, turn back, my daughters, why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. So this is the first answer you gave last time, is you're good, like, I'm not going to provide new husbands for you. If you come back with me to Israel, again, you're going to be foreigners. There's no prescription against an Israelite marrying a Moabite at this time, but they're still going to want to marry Israelites over there. If you stay here, you're going to have a much better chance of finding a husband. I want you to find a husband. I want you to go on with your life. Stay here with your people so that that can happen. So she makes this second entreaty. And then verse 14, then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. So Orpah hears this advice, and she's like, yeah, you're right. And so she goes back to her people. Ruth is sticking with Naomi. Question 15, do you think Orpah made a wise choice? Why?
Says, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me, she's probably thinking to herself, yeah, maybe this ain't quite so bad. The Lord's having a hard time with Naomi. Maybe I'll just backtrack. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
I gave her a try.
Yeah.
Most people, when it's off, they go back to the familiar.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what she is. It's easier for her instead of moving and dealing with everything new.
Yeah.
It's easier just to go back to where she was, but everything is kind of familiar and she can function.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, again, going back to our wisdom literature studies, there's this earth level view and earthly wisdom versus the godly level view. And from an earthly wisdom point of view, Orpah made a wise choice. Naomi's arguments make sense. You need to move on. You need to, you're still young. You still have a chance to have kids. You're going to have a much better chance of finding a husband if you're with your own people. You've been through enough. God is maybe mad at me. You don't want any part of that. Don't make your life any harder by now becoming a foreigner in a strange land with different customs and having to find a husband and all of that. Move on with your life in the place where it's going to be easiest. Go back to your people. If not going to phrase this in the best way, but if something were to happen to Magdalena and I were to get remarried, it would make a lot more sense for me to, be looking around the local community than to travel over to Afghanistan where I don't know anything that's going on over there. It's just pragmatically that makes sense. Stay where you know the situations. But then from the godly level view, not so much, because remember she says, verse 15, when she's talking to Ruth, she says, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. Israel has the one true God. They have the actual revelations from him. They don't always practice what they should, but they at least have access to the understanding of how God would have them behave. Orpah is going back to Moab, where they're going after Chemosh, where some of the rituals may be similar to what Israel's doing, but they're worshiping an entirely different God. And again, wisdom literature, what profit is it to gain the entire world if you lose your soul? So even if pragmatically it makes more sense for her to go back to the Moabites and live as a Moabite for the rest of her life, by the end of her life, that may not work out super well for her.
That last phrase that you said goes back to where we very first started at the beginning when you said during the Judges it was cycle.
Yeah.
And you can almost read that she says, "Oh, her to her people and her gods." Mm-hmm. So there must have been at that point, Israel as listening to God and Israel being torn into other idols. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You can almost read it in there. Just go back to the other gods. Like,
yeah,
there's actually possibly other gods.
Yeah. And so, yeah. So this is, we talked about last week how Naomi must have been a good witness to Ruth because Ruth is willing to follow her back to Israel and worship the Israelite God and everything. But then you have this here where Naomi's like, no, just go back to Moab, worship Chemosh. It's basically all the same. So maybe Naomi isn't quite as solid in her faith as we would think she is, or at best she's in that, again, I forget the actual word, but this mindset where she recognizes different gods. She'll only worship Yahweh, but she's acknowledging the presence of other gods and kind of sees them as valid. So yeah, it's fine, Orpah, go worship Chemosh. It'll be okay at the end. Which kind of leads me to think that it was Elimelech and his sons who were the spiritual heads of the household, which is a biblical mindset. So it seems entirely possible that Mahlon was more of the influence to Ruth to get her to be willing to worship God instead of Naomi, since she seems to be a little bit more wishy-washy on all of it. But yeah, so again, if you're looking at everything from the earth level view, yeah, Orpah probably did the thing that makes the most sense to her. But from the godly level view, not so much. And yeah, obviously Elimelech and his sons were witnessing to the daughters. Ruth has amazing faith through them. It's entirely possible Orpah had faith in God through them, and she maintains that faith even as she lives in the land of Moab. But just kind of knowing human nature, if you're now alone as a worshiper of Yahweh in a country where everyone worships Chemosh, and you're hoping to marry someone there who probably worships Chemosh, that pressure is probably going to mount up, and it's most likely that she goes back to Chemosh worship. Can't say for sure, but I think that's what the odds would say. So from a heavenly perspective, that was not the right choice. It's always better to be part of God's chosen people and worshiping the true God. Make sense? Hopefully I didn't offend all of the Moabites out there who will come after me. All right. Ruth's choice then was not the same. Make a list of the commitments she makes to Naomi and which of the commitments is the most important. So Ruth makes this pledge to Naomi starting in verse 16. What does she pledge and which is the most important? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a fourfold pledge. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Or where you live, I will live. Your people shall be my people, and your God will be my God. So yeah, fourth one is obviously the most important. Again, getting to this godly level view, the most important thing is to know God, know your relationship to Him, and live according to that. That's what we're talking about in our wisdom literature studies. But yeah, this is again showing that closeness between Ruth and Naomi. Wherever Naomi is going to live, Ruth is going to live with them. Whoever Naomi decides is going to be her people, Ruth is going to be one of those people. So if Naomi decided to, I don't know about England at this point, but if she decides to go to England and live with the Picts, then Ruth will go and live in England and be with the Picts. She does not want to abandon Naomi. She's very close to him, or close to her. But then part of that is this. Again, Ruth is doing this sort of thing where she acknowledges there's different gods and she'll worship the God of the land wherever she lives, but just so happens she's going back to Israel where they worship the true God, so that works out better for her. But yeah, that is the most important aspect. All right, question 17. Getting to our final section, 19 through 22, after they have returned to Israel. When Ruth and Naomi reached Bethlehem, describe the reaction of the townspeople.
I suppose the whole town was shocked that a woman's coming back. She left with the entire family, not
Yeah.
coming back all by herself. Could this actually be the Naomi that we knew that left with two sons and or left with a husband and had two sons?
Yeah. Yeah, so it says the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women said, "Is this Naomi?" So there's, again, they were in Moab for at least 10 years, probably a little bit longer. Um, you know, Bethlehem's a pretty small city. They probably knew her. The people who were there when she left, most of them are probably still there. But again, it's been, 10, 15 years since they saw her. So any time someone returns after that long, it's like, oh, wait, is that really Naomi? It's you. Hey, how you doing? So there's probably some shock and excitement there. The the notes on the handout make a point that Naomi's been through a lot of pain and stress, and she may be a little bit emaciated because she's been having to take care of herself and probably doing some hard labor. So she's maybe like much frailer looking because of all that. So there may have been some shock. Like, is that Naomi? I think that's Naomi, but I can't tell because Naomi used to be this healthy young woman, and now she's like all crumpled up. She had a husband and sons, and now it's just this random lady with her. What's going on there? So yeah, they're shocked, they're surprised, maybe excited and happy to see her back. But it does make an impact to the community when she returns. And verse 8 or question 18, how does Naomi respond to their reactions?
She chose a different name. She chose the name of humility, maybe?
Not
The Lord.
it's not humility. Um, Naomi's kind of a crotchety old woman to them. She's kind of a grump about it. They're all happy. Naomi, how you doing? And she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi," which, if you look at your footnotes, Naomi means pleasant. She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, but call me Mara," which means bitter, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Um, and this may just be because the word Mara means bitter, but you can also see this as a bit of a throwback to Exodus, or actually, I think it's the book of Numbers. But one of the times when Israel is complaining to God about not having water, um, it's they're at a water source, but the water is bitter, which maybe it was salt water, so they couldn't drink it, or there were alkali chemicals from the plants that were making the water toxic, and they couldn't drink it. But the Bible refers to that place as the waters of Mara because of the bitterness of the water. And so they complain to God, and He purifies the water. He makes it sweet so they can drink it. But there's this throwback to Israel's grumbling against God and their dissatisfaction with the way that the whole Exodus has been going in the phrase Mara that she may be hearkening to, or again, she could just be recognizing that her life has been bitter. But she's angry, she's depressed about everything she's gone through. So she's like, my life is not that pleasant. Don't call me pleasantness anymore. Call me bitterness because I'm miserable right now. So she's just kind of a grumpy, crotchety old woman. She's not seeing this as the joyous reunion that everyone else maybe is seeing it as. This is kind of the defeatist, this is the best I can do is come back to my home country where I'm alone without my husband or sons. And yeah. So, yeah, she's not super happy. Which leads us to question 19. Who does Naomi blame for her trials, and is her statement true? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So she blames. Yeah. So she blames God. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So she's blaming God for everything. Is her statement true?
Maybe that's how God got Ruth, Boaz.
Yeah.
Jesus could be the descendant
Yeah.
from him.
Yeah. So I think this is a yes and no answer, as much as we love those. But hey, we embrace the paradox. So the study writer references us to Job 1, 6 through 12, and we're running short on time, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. But that's when 1, 6 through 12 is when Satan approaches God and the whole bet starts. And so it ends. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand, only against him do not stretch your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So the study author seems to imply that she should be only blaming Satan for all the hardships. Everything is his fault. And yeah, that's an understandable reading. God doesn't cause temptation. God doesn't want us to suffer. Suffering and hardship are the result of sin that enters the world, which is because of Satan. So in that sense, her statement is false. We can blame the bad things in life on Satan because he's ultimately the reason sin is in the world. However, to counter that, though, we also have Job 2:10. Um, this is after the calamities have fallen upon Job, and his wife is trying to be like, God did this all to us. Why don't you just curse him and die, or go find another god or something? And Job says to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So, as much as, Satan, in a sense, is responsible for all hardships, we don't want to fall into this dualistic mindset of thinking that God and Satan are on equal footing. God is still in control of everything. Nothing happens without God's permission. Um, and as Dial said, through this whole ordeal is how Ruth is going to find Boaz and become the great grandmother of Jesse, and the messianic line is going to be fulfilled. So this all is fitting into God's plan still, and recognizing that God is in control of everything kind of is God who makes this all happen. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they don't yeah, they can't see the big picture. And so you tend to jump to conclusions. So I would say, Naomi's assessment is correct, but the attitude behind it all is not. Like she's like, oh, God just hates me and he's being mean because reasons, which, yeah, if I were in her position, I'd probably feel that way too. That's understandable. And again, God is in control of everything. So, yeah, in a sense, God has done it to her, but it's ultimately for her good, because again, through all of this, the Savior is going to come who will be the salvation for Naomi and all of Israel. So, yeah, like I said, it's a yes-no paradoxical answer, I think. All right. If you're willing, share a time of difficulty you've gone through, and who did you turn to for help? And if no one wants to share, that's fine because we're almost out of time. Oh, yeah, cancer diagnosis. That's hard. Yep. Yeah, that's the Paul talks about how he has the thorn in his flesh, whatever that is, we're not sure, but he's praying to God to remove it. But then he's like, but in order to make sure I stay humble, God allows it to continue on with me. So even in suffering, you can find God. As much as the situation is unpleasant, hopefully your attitude is such that it helps you to lean on God and rely on God even more. That's the Romans 8 idea of how God can work all things to good for those who love him, even if it's suffering in the moment. In the big picture, it can lead to the ultimate good of, again, relying on God, knowing God, and receiving the salvation from him. Sorry, I'm rushing a bit, but we're at time. 21, what bit of good news did Ruth and Naomi receive then at the very end? Very last verse of chapter 1. Right. So they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So that means barley has grown and there's enough to actually harvest. So the famine is definitely over. Food is back in the land. And again, there is this right of gleaning. That's the law of the land in Israel. So they will be able to glean from the fields. And so they will have food available to in one form or another. So we'll talk about gleaning more in the next chapter. But we're at time. So if you want to read through the lecture notes of lesson 3 on your own, you can. I think most of the points that are on here we talked about in the questionnaire anyway. So there we go. So if you want to do, technically the questions are supposed to be homework that you fill out on your own and then we discuss it. But I'm not grading you. If you want to just wait until next week when we go through the questions and write stuff in, then that's fine. But next week we'll be looking at Ruth 2, 1 through 23. So again, even though it's going to be lesson 4, it'll be the questions that say lesson 3 at the top, which, again, because they're numbered confusingly, I put on the back of the lesson 2 packet. So you have if you have the lesson 2 packet, the back page are the lesson 3 questions that are actually for lesson 4. If you don't want to deal with all that nonsense, I have just the questions here, and you can grab the lesson 3 questions that actually apply to lesson 4 because numbers are dumb. So I'll put these on the top of the pile in the back, and you can grab one at some point today. And then next week we'll do the questions from lesson 3, which are actually about lesson 4 for Ruth chapter 2. Clear as mud? Okay. I will pray us out, and then we can get ready for the service. Heavenly Father, again, we thank you that you watched over Naomi and Ruth, and through them you brought about the Messiah. And we thank you for this recording of their ordeal, that we might look through their lives and see the ways that they trusted you and the ways that you rewarded that trust through the salvation that comes to them. We thank you for this insight into how you can use even pain and calamity to your own good purposes, that in the end all things do work for good for those who love you. And we ask that you would give that assurance to us as we face hardships and difficulties in this life, that we would recognize you are with us always, that you can use even the evils of this world to your good end, and that all things will work to your plan, which is the love and salvation for all of us. We thank you for all of these gifts, and we ask that you bless us as we are about to receive them through your divine service. In your name we pray. Amen.